The Keynesian cross is a short-term macroeconomic model of goods market equilibrium only, where it allows us to determine the equilibrium level of output or income for a given level of spending in the short term. Now, certain key assumptions of the Keynesian cross include number one, the prices are fully sticky, which means that they're not going to change in the short run. So this is a fixed price. The second key assumption is that output is completely aggregate demand determined, which means that whatever your demand is, that's going to be your production. So there's no role of the supply side when we're talking about the Keynesian cost, as this assumes that producers are ready to change quantity to match whatever the demand is to clear the market. Now, when it comes to the behavioral assumptions that we make in the Keynesian cross, the first is that consumption is an increasing linear function of disposable income. So over here, the C bar stands for autonomous consumption, which is the consumption level when disposable income is zero. MPC is the change in consumption due to $1 increase in disposable income, and by minus T is the disposable income, which is income minus taxes. And as far as the investment function is concerned, we're assuming that investment is exogenously determined, so I is equal to I bar, where I bar is your autonomous investment. And similarly, when we're looking at the fiscal policy, we're assuming that government spending and taxation are exogenously given. So G is equal to G bar and T is equal to T bar, where G bar is the autonomous government spending and T bar is the autonomous taxes. And here we're assuming that there's no foreign sectors. We're going to be analyzing the Keynesian cost for the closed economy. For now, that's for net exports, exports, imports are all you can see. Now this covers the definition. Now let's move on to the definitions. Now there are two key definitions that are involved in the Keynesian clause. Number one is the aggregate demand. Now the aggregate demand is the demand for domestically produced goods and services. So your aggregate demand equation is the same as your GDP expenditure equation. So it's just your private consumption plus your private investment plus your government purchases plus net exports. But in this case, because we're doing it for a closed economy, so net exports is zero. So in general, aggregate demand is just C plus I plus G plus NX. But given the assumptions that we made over here, so aggregate demand, we can simplify it in this form. C bar plus MPC y minus T bar plus I bar plus G bar when we plug in our assumptions in this. So, and secondly, we need to keep in mind that here in the Keynesian cross, output will be represented by a 45-degree line. The 45-degree line has a slope of 1. Now, why do we need this? This is because when you're plotting the Keynesian cross graphically, on the vertical axis, we take aggregate demand, and on the horizontal axis, we take our output or income or real GDP, because output, income, real GDP, they all mean the same thing. So now the problem is that when we're looking at equilibrium in the Keynesian cross, we want to compare aggregate demand and output. And aggregate demand is on the vertical axis, but output is on the horizontal axis. So we draw this 45-degree line so that we can take what's on the x-axis, which is output, to the y-axis. Because if this much represents y1 on the x-axis, then because the 45-degree line has a slope of 1, so using the 45-degree line, I can see that this much represents y1 on the vertical axis. And like this, we can then directly compare it with aggregate demand, which is on the vertical axis. Now, if we move on to equilibrium, so equilibrium in the goods market equilibrium by the Keynesian cross, mathematically, if we want to solve for it, it's going to be where we set our aggregate demand is equal to our output or income. So this is in general that the equilibrium is where AD is equal to Y, but given the assumptions that we made, once we plug in the aggregate demand function, using the assumptions we had equal to Y, and then you can solve for Y. So for this particular model, where given this set of assumptions, this is our output level. So mathematically, you can always solve for output, which is setting aggregate demand is equal to output, because as you mentioned, output is completely aggregate demand determined. The supply side plays no part of it. Where producers are ready to match whatever the demand is. Now, graphically, if you want to look at the Keynesian cross, so for that, on the vertical axis, we take aggregate demand. On the horizontal axis, we take real GDP output or over here, we first plot our aggregate demand line, where we have a slope equal to MPC, and the vertical intercept is your C bar plus I bar plus G bar minus T bar into MPC. And this again comes from the assumptions that we made, where we can look at this expression over here. From here, we can rewrite it in the slope intercept form, and we can see that C bar plus I bar plus G bar minus MPC T bar is a vertical intercept, and MPC is our slope. Now, this is the aggregate demand equation. Then we draw the 45-degree line to represent output, because again, if we're measuring aggregate demand on the vertical axis, we also want to have a measure of output on the vertical axis, which we can use the 45-degree line for to transfer output from the horizontal axis to the vertical axis, so that we can directly compare them over here, because equilibrium is where they both are equal to each other. So what we do is we plot this AD, upward sloping AD line, we plot a 45-degree line which represents the output. So our equilibrium graphically in the Keynesian cross is given to us as a point of intersection of your aggregate demand and your 45-degree line representing your output. So this is the equilibrium. Now, what if you are in a state of disequilibrium? How will you move to equilibrium in this particular model? So in this case, the adjustment is not going to happen through price, because in this particular model, the price is fixed. When you look at a micro demand supply model, so in that, price adjusts whenever you have excess demand, excess supply, but that's in a micro demand supply model. But in this particular model, the adjustment cannot happen through price, because this is a fixed price model where prices are fixed. So the adjustment is going to happen through output. Or for instance, assume that your level of output Y1 is below the equilibrium level of output. Now we know this is output on the horizontal axis. I want a measure of this Y1 on the vertical axis. So for that, we just simply use the 45-degree line. And based on the 45-degree line, I can see, okay, this is Y1 on the vertical axis. And I can compare it to the aggregate demand on the vertical axis, which we already have. And based on this, we can see, okay, we have an excess demand, because at Y1, where ED1 is greater than Y1. So when you have an excess demand, this would mean that your inventory start decreasing, and as a result, you'll start increasing output and will eventually come back to the equilibrium level of output. But what if your output was above the equilibrium level of output, say at Y1? Again, using the 45-degree line, I can see this is how much Y1 is on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, this is how much Y1 would be. And we can see the Y1 is greater than ED1 in this case. So as a result, you have an excess supply. So inventory start building up. As a result, you reduce output until we come back to the equilibrium level of output. So in this case, any adjustment that happens is going to be through output, because prices are fixed in this particular model.